Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Reading biographies profiling specific people in history is something I haven't done much on this show, Classical Ideas. I'm sitting here in my office right now, and I'm looking through my past episode list, and I've found episodes that biographically profile most of the guests for the introductory parts of discussions on the episodes, but there aren't many episodes that rarely discuss one person. So I'm sitting here looking at my episodes, and I'm seeing G.I. Gurdjieff, John Wanamaker, Mary Magdalene, Alan Watts, Ruth Ann Sokeon Sasaki, Dinty W. Moore. Okay, maybe I have discussed more specific biographies than I previously thought. But anyway, today's episode is about the life of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, one of the most important Tibetan Buddhist teachers to have ever lived. He lived from 1813 to 1899, so his life is still quite accessible to us in our contemporary times. Kongtrul was known for collecting, arranging, and disseminating various lineage teachings in Tibet across sectarian lines. So to me, he seems like sort of a model of forward-thinking, interreligious dialogue with what was possible in the 19th century, and more specifically in Tibet. And reading this book that we're going to talk about today, I couldn't help but wonder who Kongtrul would be in today's world and what kind of barriers he would seek to break. I think he would be quite prolific. So my guest today is Dr. Alex Gardner, author of a brand new Kongtrul biography, The Life of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, which is out now from Snow Lion, an imprint of Shambhala Publications. Gardner is the director and chief editor of the Treasury of Lives, which we talk about extensively in this conversation. Gardner completed his PhD in Buddhist Studies at the University of Michigan. It was a real delight to chat with Alex Gardner about the life of an influential Buddhist leader that I had never heard of before. And if you want to follow Gardner and read more about his work, you can follow him on Twitter at twitter.com/Treasury of Lives. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Alex Gardner on the life of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great. Dr. Alexander Gardner, welcome to Classical Ideas. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm very excited to join your show.
Excellent. Well, I'm just hoping you can spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience however you see fit.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Vermont, and I have a PhD in Buddhist studies, and almost everybody I tell that to says, "What? You can do that?" And I explain that it's religious studies in the same way that you would study Islam or Judaism, and then they sort of understand that. So, I've been interested in Buddhism since my undergraduate days, and I love that I keep getting to be involved with it.
Wonderful. Well, I'm kind of curious about your academic path a little bit in Buddhist studies. What were some of your crucial stepping stones or turning points along your journey into that field?
Sure. Well, my dad was kind of a religious seeker. So I grew up with, books about Ram Dass and, Be Here Now and all that stuff. And so when I was 17, my dad and I did a course in transcendental meditation. So I developed a daily sitting practice, I think it was about 45 minutes twice a day.
Wow.
Which I kept up for years. And I wasn't really keyed into the sort of religious context of transcendental meditation, which there is a great deal. We were just sort of focused on the concentration meditation. And I didn't really pursue that, but I kept up the practice. And then when I got to college, college is a great place to explore new ideas and get exposed to whole new things. And so I fell in with some friends who were Buddhist, and then I started reading more, and it really sort of aligned with my interests and my questions, really. So from there, I just, after I graduated college, I started traveling in Asia, doing pilgrimage, meeting with religious teachers, meditating. I did that for a couple of years.
Awesome. And then you did your PhD at Michigan, right?
Right. So the more I learned, the more I realized I needed to know. I mean, I wasn't, as I was traveling, I was being exposed to a lot of things, but I didn't really fully understand. And I love reading, and I love writing, and I love really sort of having conversations about history and people and places. So I applied for grad school at the University of Michigan, which is really one of the best places to study Buddhism broadly, because there's scholars in Tibet, there's scholars in Japan, the scholars of Chinese Buddhism, of Southeast Asian Buddhism. So I did that, and then after the first 2 years, I finished my master's degree, and I decided I needed better language training. So I went to Chengdu in Sichuan province, spent a year there studying Chinese and Tibetan, and had a great time traveling around Tibetan areas of Sichuan province. Tibet's sort of divided into five separate Chinese provinces. So and then the more, basically that's where I found my dissertation topic.
What's your dissertation topic?
So I studied the work of three very famous Tibetan lamas. One called Jamgon Kongtrul, who the book is about.
Yep.
The second was Khyentse Wangpo, and then the third one is Chögyal Lingpa. And the three of them are very famous in Buddhism today for having sort of collected a whole lot of Buddhist teachings and traditions and books and literature, and sort of they edited them, they published them, and they're also famous for going around eastern Tibet, the part that I was traveling in, and visiting caves and monasteries and mountains and doing all sorts of religious rituals and practices for local people and for the communities there.
What do you think it was about Tibet that drew you into the area as a scholarly interest?
Well, the landscape is beautiful. You just can't avoid. The mountains just soar up into the sky, covered in ice, and the valleys are certainly in eastern Tibet. The valleys are very narrow with these huge rushing rivers, and then monasteries perched on cliffs, surrounded by forest. It's very dramatic and very beautiful. So growing up in Vermont, I sort of responded to that: the mountains and the forest and the lakes and the rivers, and then the people. The culture is very traditional, and I think Americans, me certainly, we're searching for that sort of traditional way of life where we're not encumbered by so much stuff and distracted at all times. So I, as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, I responded well to the focus, the sort of clean focus on so the farmer's farm and the religious, massive presence of religion in Tibet. At one point, I think they said that a quarter of the population was ordained as a monk or a nun.
Oh, wow.
It's an amazing percentage of the people. So there are monasteries and temples everywhere, and every cliffside has a cave that is sacred to some lama or is the presence of some deity or so it's very present. And I love religion. Ever since I was a kid, I've always loved religion, and I was really looking for religion and expressions of religion and practices of religion. So that appealed to me that way. Nice.
I want to dive into the book here in a second, but I kind of want to know about what you do every day. I know that you're the director and chief editor at the Treasury of Lives, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you guys you promote biographies and the study of Tibetan Buddhism. Kind of, what do you do over there?
That's right. So we collect and we do some writing ourselves, but we sort of commission essays. And so the point of the Treasury of Lives is it's biographies of primarily Tibetan Buddhists, so the great masters of the past. There's a long tradition in Buddhism of writing the biographies of the guru, of the teachers. It's sort of they're both models for the religious life, and they're also the inspiration for people who are themselves pursuing religion. So, and it's also a way for the institutions to build themselves and to sort of solidify their lineage and their tradition. So I love biographies. I love stories of people. I think, personally, I respond to that. I find it inspiring. I find it, really sort of edifying to learn how other people did it, and how, and what they learned and what they practiced. So we've been doing this for well over 10 years. We have almost 1,200 biographies at this point. And it's freely available for the public. We have academic standards, but we're written for a general audience. So really anyone who's interested in Tibet or Buddhism, Tibetan history, Tibetan culture, it's available and it's there, and it's all fully linked with art and other websites that provide information.
Have you ever had any high school teachers reach out to you about using the resources, or have you heard any feedback about how teachers have used your resources in their classrooms?
Yeah, it's been a sort of a dream of ours to create curricula for high school. We definitely know that college teachers use it. But it's certainly written for. I think the high school reader could access it. So definitely that's something on our agenda. We want to expand the pedagogical aspects more.
That's fantastic. As a high school teacher, I fully encourage you to pursue that avenue in the future, because mean, anything that you can do to make high school teachers' lives better while also providing them resources on things that are undertaught and underexplored. I mean, that's just a fantastic thing you can do. All right, so let's dive into this book. The Life of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great, a famous Tibetan Buddhist master. This is my first exposure to this Lama's life. When did you first hear about the life of Kongtrul? What drew you into his story?
Sure. Well, he's incredibly famous and influential in Buddhism today. So as I was taking teachings with Tibetan Lamas, or even Westerners who teach Tibetan Buddhism, there's so many stories of his life. So Kongtrul did this, or Kongtrul did that, or here's a book we're going to read. He wrote so much and collected so much that the literature is full of his name. So he was always in the back of my mind, but it was really when that year that I spent in China, when I was traveling in Eastern Tibetan areas, that I came across his name all the time and became more and more sort of impressed on how much of an impact he had. And because I was really interested in the sort of the material life of Tibetan Buddhists, the where, and the who, and the how that they did their things. Not, I love the teaching. I love the sort of the grand abstract ideas of the teaching. But I'm primarily interested in the history of it, and who taught the teachings, and where, and why, and when. And so Kongtrul was really present in the landscape, in those caves and in those mountains, and I just kept hearing more and more and more about him. Yeah.
So as you heard about him, did you go looking for resources and notice that there was a lack of biographical information available about him?
Yeah, there's Tibetans, like I said, they love the life story of the Lama, but there's this, it's more hagiographical, which means that it's more sort of generic. Like the Lama is always depicted as having, being brilliant at birth, and easily understanding everything, and studying everything, and having no trouble at all, and that's nice in sort of an inspirational way. But I think I think a life story, in order to really get to be inspirational, I think it needs to have some challenges. Somebody has to really face an obstacle and overcome that obstacle in order to inspire. And so I was sort of familiar with the general outline of Kongtrul, because there's enough translations of his work out there, and the introductions to these translations tend to have a short sketch of his life. And he had a really interesting life. He was born in the the Bön tradition, which is a sort of non-Buddhist, indigenous religious tradition of Tibet that existed before the Buddhists came in. And then he moved to a monastery in the Nyingma tradition, which is one tradition. And then he brought sort of against his will to another monastery in another tradition. And then he just started, with that kind of background, he just started exploring everything that he could find. And to me, as a sort of aspiring scholar, that was such an appealing model, to not just settle with, oh, this is what I was born with, this is what I'm going to study for the rest of my life. I mean, he really went out, he sought out actively everything he could find.
Yeah, I mean, in the book you write that he was like a polymath and that he was constantly curious. And I mean, this is a relatively recent guy. He only lived between 1813 and 1899. So, I mean, he's accessible in our recent past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he lived during Lincoln, during Emerson. I mean, he was alive during things, the Civil War and the emancipation of the slaves. I mean, huge events that happened in our history happened during his lifetime. And that's sort of, in a way that makes him almost, you can almost reach out and touch him.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always like looking for people. The reason I do this show is because I'm just curious about what goes on in other parts of the world. That is the reason I do this show. So whenever I see that a person like Kongtrul is doing the exact same things, that's just inspiring to me to read about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's studying different religions is such a great way to gain insight about your own tradition, right, and what's happening right around you.
For sure.
Yeah.
Why? So he had two partners, right? That you mentioned earlier. Who were they again?
Yeah, Khyentse Wangpo and Chogyur Lingpa.
Okay, so why did you start with Kongtrul's biography instead of writing about one of those other fellows?
Right. Well, mostly because. So the three of them had different roles. Kongtrul really was the guy who was going out and gathering everything. Chogyur Lingpa was this crazy, brilliant, charismatic fellow who was always revealing what the Tibetans call treasure, and it's this stuff that the great guru of the 8th century who brought Buddhism to Tibet, according to Tibetan legend, that Padmasambhava, he's called the lotus-born guru, and he is said to have gone all across Tibet and Bhutan and Nepal and Sikkim and even Mongolia and other parts of sort of the Tibetan cultural sphere. And he left teachings or objects to be found by later generations. So the story is when something is no longer vital, a teaching or a religion is no longer sort of responding to the needs of the time, then a great charismatic treasure revealer, someone like Chogyur Lingpa, will discover it. He's fated for it. So he was going around to these caves and literally, according to the tradition, pulling books out of the rocks and then giving them to the people. And that's one of the things that Kongtrul and Khyentse were they would take this revelation, this massive new inspiration, and sort of translate it into books and ritual manuals that people could use. So that's what Chogyur Lingpa did. He didn't really teach. He was out there providing the material. Kongtrul was the one who was setting it down, organizing it, editing it, publishing it, transmitting it forward. And Khyentse was kind of the I don't know, sort of the intellectual inspiration for it. He mostly stayed in his monastery. He mostly meditated and wrote. He did a lot of his own writing. And he also did a lot of revelation of his own, but he just did it sort of sitting in his room. He would have a vision, or he would have this sort of out-of-body experience, and he would produce his own treasures in that way.
Excellent. Well, I kind of want to linger on this. We're kind of on the topic of the context of Kongtrul's life, and I want to talk about this for a few minutes. So you write in the book, and you just kind of describe how Kongtrul collects, arranges, disseminates the different lineage traditions of Tibet across sectarian lines.
Right.
Which is really interesting to me because that just demonstrates his curiosity for what other people are thinking and doing. What were the sectarian lines of Tibet during Kongtrul's life? I know there's a few Tantric traditions and a treasure lineage. Can you describe kind of what these are?
Yeah, so Tibet I mean, there's sort of two ways of looking at it. One is there's just monasteries everywhere, and the monasteries in Tibet were really the main political and economic vehicles for the culture. The monasteries controlled most of the land in very similar ways to sort of the great manor houses of Great Britain. You know, they controlled the resources. They hired the artisans. They hired the craftsmen. They were involved in all the trade across the Tibetan plateau. So they had their own sort of vested institutional interests in their own teachings. And then there's sort of cross-institutional teachings. Generally, it's said that there's sort of four main traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. And then within those four main traditions, there's tons and tons of sort of subdivisions of them. And they're all Buddhist, and they're all engaged in roughly the same stuff. But they all have their subtle differences to distinguish themselves basically from the next monastery down the valley. You know, they have to be unique somehow in order to attract their disciples. So at various times in Tibetan history, you know, you would walk to the other valley, even if it wasn't in your own tradition, and you would take teachings from some brilliant master, or you would know that there were books there. And so across Tibetan history, people were doing that always. There's a long tradition of sort of intersectarian exchange in Tibet. But at the same time, there is a tradition of sort of parochialism and sectarianism, especially when the Dalai Lama's government take control of Tibet during the 16th century. Suddenly, for the first time ever, the Dalai Lama, was made king of Tibet with patronage from the Mongolians and then later from the Chinese. And so, you know, where Tibet fit into sort of the Chinese empire impacted suddenly, you know, who's got the army and who's really controlling trade on a pan-Tibetan level. And the Dalai Lama belongs to the tradition called the Gelug. And the Gelug decided that in order to really establish control of Tibet, they were going to in some ways crush the other religious traditions. And they went out and they converted monasteries and they banned certain teachings that they didn't like. They claimed conflicted. So there is that also. There is some real sort of sectarian violence and sort of chauvinism that and Kongtrul sort of was he grew up. You know, he was active in Eastern Tibet, where the central Tibetan government of the Dalai Lamas wasn't very strong, but it was still felt. There were definitely monasteries around him that were just orthodox. They were controlled by the central government, and they didn't play well with others so much. They were less interested in exchange of ideas and practices.
Okay, so you write that like Kongtrul, like crossing traditional divides, is an example of Tibetan ecumenism, known as something. It's Rimé.
Rimé, yeah.
Rimé.
Yeah.
Okay, what is Rimé, and how does Kongtrul utilize this?
Right. Yeah, that's actually been a subject of huge scholarly discussion in the last 20, 30 years, because like what is Rimé and what Kongtrul did, because he's really, I see him as an exemplar. But others have said no. He founded a whole new thing. He was a social reformer. But I don't really see that. I think what he did has a long tradition. Rimé, the word, just means non-sectarian. Ri means sort of tradition or lineage, and Rei means without. So it just means ecumenicalism. And there's plenty of examples of people in Tibetan history who used the term and described what they did as sort of, you know, and it's a nice compliment that you give somebody in Tibet. Oh, he's really Rimé, or she's really Rimé. You know, it means they're not bogged down in partisanship and dualistic thinking, right? Because they're Buddhist, right? They're not supposed to judge and think mine way is better than your way. So Kongtrul used the term a little bit, but he really embodied the thing. He did his tradition. He was definitely, I mean, he did his Kagyu tradition. He produced books in that tradition. He was also interested in Nyingma, for that was his initial training, and he did books in that tradition. But he also did these big compilations that had examples of everybody. So there was Gelug teachings and Kadam teachings and Jonang teachings and Sakya teaching, and they were all put together. And that's kind of rare in Tibet, and that's really what he left us with as a model, not just his life as a model, because he was engaging with all these teachers, but these huge collections that are being translated now actually into English, which is fantastic. And he left these as a model where we could, as sort of practitioners and students of Buddhism, we can look at these collections and say, oh, I don't have to choose one. I don't have to get stuck in one and think the others are no good or bad. I can, I might prefer one, and I might take as my religious practice one of these paths, but that doesn't mean I have to denigrate, or dismiss the others.
Yeah. He strikes me as like very pragmatic, practical, reaching the people who tend animals, people who harvest grain. Like, is he some kind of, like centrist pragmatist who's just trying to make people who are living ordinary lives? Is he just trying to make their lives better?
I think so. I mean, he was like I said, he did a lot of public rituals, and rituals like that in Tibet mean anything from, calling down the great protectors of the valley to defend a monastery, to like going to a village and making sure that the families have a good harvest, or even doing rain-making rituals. He was constantly employed by the kings and queens of the area, by the great monasteries of the area, but also by the wealthy families in a given valley, to do rituals that benefit the public.
Okay, so in the book you write about how he was constantly sanctifying sacred sites, building temples, establishing Buddhist rituals, about Padmasambhava. So that's a figure that I want to know a little more about as well. Who is Padmasambhava, and why does Kongtrul dedicate his efforts to Padmasambhava?
Right. So Padmasambhava, that's the fellow who hid all the treasures around.
Yeah.
And it's such a great way to think about space and think about land. You can think, there's lots of caves in Tibet. There's lots of like rocky outcrops and big boulders that provide shelter for somebody who wants to, meditate for a week or a year. And so all of these places, they have significance for the local community. A village, how does a village cohere? They have common language. They all work the fields together, but they also have, what do they care about? What are their values? And their values are getting along with each other, and their values are sort of the things that the sort of the metaphors and the things that bring them together as a community. And religion does that beautifully. And so each valley in Tibet has its own protector god, and each valley in Tibet usually has a meditation cave up in the hills where some great saint, meditated. And usually that cave is associated with Padmasambhava, because Padmasambhava went everywhere. He, according to Tibetan tradition, he visited every single valley you can't imagine. He was constant, and he would go and he would do some religious practice, and he would name the local protector gods, and then he would insert some treasure into the place. Maybe it was medicinal pills, or maybe it was a spring, or maybe it was a grand teaching system that was going to inspire generations of people. And so Padmasambhava is very, very present in the Tibetan landscape, and he's sort of localized in every single cave, in every single sort of temple that has a statue of him.
So I'd imagine that Padmasambhava is still relevant in Tibet today, in that region?
Huge. Yeah, huge. Really all across Tibet. Even the Gelug who, come from a later sort of dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet, they even venerate him to a large degree, because he's the guy who conquered the demons who didn't want Buddhism. He's the guy who went in and really sort of drove Buddhism into the ground of Tibet. And so he's also, because of his presence, he's constantly sort of showing up again to do more. He's really, really, really present in Tibet.
So is Kongtrul kind of like one of the most well-known and prevalent, teachers of Padmasambhava in Tibet?
In a way, yeah, because one of the great collections that he did was he collected all of these treasures that had that come, not just his friend Chögyal Lingpa's treasures, but treasures that stretched back 1,000 years before him. Um, well, maybe not, 800 years before him or so. That people, Kongtrul in his diary, he writes, he was worried that they were going to get lost. And they could have been lost because people stopped practicing them, people stopped reading them. Mostly in Tibet, Tibet didn't really have printing until I think around the 15th century, 14th, 16th century, and that was still printing by woodblock. So they would by hand carve, they would carve a piece of wood, and then spread ink on it and print it on a piece of handmade paper, and that continued up until the 20th century. They really didn't have modern printing technology. They didn't have movable type. And then at the same time, these monasteries, they're invaded by mice and birds. And so if there's one handwritten copy of this this teaching, which, Kongtrul looked at all of these teachings and said, they're beautiful. They're beautiful in their own way. They're valuable for somebody. Let's not let them become a nest for mice, let's preserve them. And so he's the guy, with Chögyal Lingpa and Khyentse's help, but he's the one who collected all the treasures that he could find, and he published them. And these are now his collection is now used in Tibetan Buddhist communities all over the world to transmit these forward. Tibetans transmit their teachings first by reading them, and so they sit down in these huge public rituals and they just read at lightning speed, and that gives you a reading transmission of the text. And then once you've had that transmission, you get an empowerment. You get you go through this personal ritual with the Lama, and that also can be huge and public. And then you're empowered. You're sort of you've been given permission to practice it. So then you can read and practice it, which means then once you master it, you can teach it. So he enabled the transmission of these teachings for the last 150 years. They've been around because of Kongtrul.
What is the legacy and the popularity of Kongtrul like in Tibet today in 2019?
I think he continues to be huge among sort of the elite monastic settings. They know him as an excellent scholar, as somebody who did his reading, who understood the doctrine, and published commentaries and books. And then popularly, he's beloved because of this I think because of his ecumenicalism, because he showed people that it's okay to embrace everything, and he didn't do it in a wishy-washy sort of new age way where like you take your favorite part of this and you take your favorite part of that and you get rid of the stuff that you don't like. It's not a buffet kind of ecumenicalism. He really believed in the integrity of each sort of teaching system, and he advocated pick one, and do it and pursue it to get the value of it, and then maybe do something else, and then pursue that and do it all. Don't just take the easy parts, right? Don't just take the parts that you agree with, because then you're not being challenged.
Yeah. It sounds like he's open to changing his mind too, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of scholarship, I want to know a little bit about your research process for this expansive book. Like, did you travel anywhere? Did you do archives? Tell me about this journey of creating this big full book.
Right. Yeah. So I was very fortunate to get funding after I finished my coursework at the University of Michigan. I got a Fulbright grant to go and live in Tibet for a year.
Awesome.
And so I sat with a family who was actually a high school teacher in this town where Kongtrul lived, and then my friend's brother happened to be a monk. So I went and stayed with him. And he wasn't a monk at Kongtrul's monastery, but he was a monk at Khyentse Wangpo's monastery. So I went and stayed with him for a couple of months. And I just sat and read, and I just moved around, and I walked the landscape, and I went to the places where Kongtrul went, to get a sense of, if I'm going to be writing about somebody who was constantly moving around the landscape, I wanted to know, well, how do you get there? How do you get from Kongtrul's monastery to Khyentse's monastery? They're close, but it's a half a day's walk over a mountain pass. You better have a donkey or somebody carrying your stuff, because it's hard. it's beautiful. There's these high alpine meadows with flowers and trees so I spent most of my day while I was there reading, and I read Kongtrul's diary, and I read his biography of Khyentse Wangpo, and then I started reading all of this material around Chogyal Lingpa, where there's a lot of biographies of him, and then all the books that they would produce, they had sections saying where they produced it and when and how, especially the treasures, like where does it come. There's all these histories of the treasures. Like I went there and I did this amazing thing, and I flew to the roof of a cave and I pulled this book out of the rock, and really sort of cool adventure stories. So I spent a year doing that, and then I came back and I read everything else I could find. It really was a reading project primarily. There's a great amount of material. And one of the reasons I was able to write this book really was because of this material. Because he's fairly recent and because he left a detailed diary, it was possible to write a sort of Western style biography of his sort of day-to-day pursuits. Whereas most Tibetans, they didn't do that. They didn't leave diaries. There's no sort of what is it? There's no sort of public record like we have. Like if you're doing a biography of Emerson, you have court records, you have newspaper clippings, you have all sorts of data and information about him that you don't have in Tibet. So yeah.
Okay, so this research process that you did has resulted in a ton of additional features that you have packed into this book as well. So there's a 30-page index, 13-page bibliography, 30 pages of notes, several maps, and then something that really captured my attention. It's 50 pages of what is labeled as Tibetan orthographic equivalents. Is this a pronunciation guide?
No, it's a that's there for scholars. I mean, that's like, you see that and you say, oh, okay, obviously this guy did a PhD, and that's sort of like an academic standard thing, because Tibetan is such a weird language in terms of writing. It's an alphabet, but their spelling is so archaic that in any given word or symbol even, there's maybe sometimes 4 or 5 silent letters. And then combinations of letters become very similar to like our GH, can become a F, or a PH can become a F, and you don't know that unless you were trained to know that. That's not intuitive, right? But Tibetan has that in spades. So when you write Tibetan, so I'm writing a book about, some academics, they'll write a book or an article and they'll only use what's called Wylie, which is the standard sort of letter for letter transcription of Tibetan, and it's completely unreadable and unpronounceable if you don't know Tibetan already. So I had to take that and put it into sort of North American English phonetics. I couldn't spell his name the way it's spelled in Tibetan because it wouldn't be readable. But I had to sort of, in my own mind, hear the way it was, but through talking to Tibetans, how would you write that in English, right? So I did that, and so there's no of this, Wylie in the book itself. But then scholars, like myself, if I'm reading a book that does this phonetics, I'm going to, well, what's the Tibetan for that? How do you spell that in Tibetan? So that's what this whole thing is, 50 pages. It's like, it's so long and cumbersome, and it's really only there for specialists who need it.
I mean, you obviously worked insanely hard on this because so I'm looking at, so we have the name Jamgon Kongtrul, and then is it Lodro Te?
Yeah, Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Taye. Yeah.
Taye. Okay, so in the Wylie column, it says JAMMGON.
Yeah.
KONGSPRUL BLOGROSMTHAYAS.
Yeah.
And that is like the full spelling of Jamgon Kongtrul.
Yeah.
For Wylie, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's how, if I was using, so that like the MTHA, and then there's a little apostrophe there. That's actually a letter also.
Oh, yeah, I have that in the notes. I forgot to say the apostrophe. Yeah. So how do you pronounce the MTHA with the apostrophe?
Ta.
Okay.
So like that's all. There's like extraneous letters. Like those are the M is silent. The th. It's the difference between ta and ta. It's sort of aspirated. You have a like you breathe out a little bit when you say it, and then that apostrophe is just a silent suffix that isn't pronounced at all.
Okay, because like if I look at the name, so it's Jamgon Kongtrul, and then in Kongtrul in the Wiley, it's Kong, so Kong, like
Yeah.
it is on the page
Yeah,
on the
that's
book.
easy.
But
Yeah.
then there's Sprul
Right.
instead of Trul, so it looks like
Right.
Sprull instead
Right.
of Troll.
Yeah. Yeah. So the S in that is silent, and then the PR produces t, and the last L sort of changes the vowel a little bit, but it's not. It's sometimes pronounced, sometimes not regionally. And then there's in Ladakh in northern India, which is a Tibetan area. They actually pronounce almost everything. So when they talk, it sounds like they would say Kongtrul. They would actually pronounce those letters that most other Tibetans wouldn't.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is there any other like basics that people should know about the Tibetan language? Like if you were just like suggesting somebody to try and learn something very basic who's like never heard of this before, like do you have any tips on how to go about learning something that's, different?
Right. It's a beautiful script. I mean, and remember, we're not. This is an alphabet that they write. They don't write Sprul. They write sa bata da shibju dru la drul. So
I have a Tibetan banner here. Can you see this?
Oh, cool. Oh, yeah. That's the very famous Om Mani Padme Hung mantra.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I got this recently as a present, and I'm gonna have it like framed so I can hang it in my office here.
Oh, very nice, very auspicious, it's very good karma to have that around.
I love that. That is wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you went over to Tibet, were you trained at all in Tibetan before you went, or was this something that you were like learning all along the way?
Yeah, learning all the way. I mean, I certainly I had studied Tibetan. I studied classical Tibetan in university, and then I had Chinese. I did the Middlebury language summer program, so I had sort of contemporary Chinese that I could use to get around with. And then I did that year of language training, so I was able to converse with people. But primarily, my training is in reading, and obviously from the way the conversation we just had about how they write. What you write and read is very different from what you say and what you hear. So it's almost two different languages. It's like ancient Greek and modern Greek. They're not the same language.
You mentioned there are still many unanswered questions on Kongtrul in the book. What were you unable to find out that is still leaving you wondering?
Well, one of the big themes of his later life is that he was kicked out of his monastery. He was made unwelcome. There was this faction of probably Orthodox monks who didn't like him, and they never really liked him because he came from another monastery, a different tradition, and then he really had this sort of meteoric ascent to prominence. And so I think there was a lot of people who were jealous of him, a lot of people who didn't really trust his loyalty. And then as he went out, when you're a lama and you're a famous religious teacher, you collect offerings, you collect donations. It's how the monasteries survived, was not just their landholdings and the rent, but also when you do a ritual, you're paid for it through offerings. And so Kongtrul was collecting a lot of offerings that some of these monks thought, well, they shouldn't be going to him, they should be going to us, or they should be going to our teacher. And that's all very vaguely presented in his diary. And there's not a lot of explanations of it. Kongtrul even mentions a court case that he was at the local, sort of the royal center of the area. And so there was a big fight and a real struggle. And I think it was an example of sectarianism, and I think it was about resources. And I also think it was about Kongtrul himself started revealing treasure, which is dangerous and sort of on the edge, and really only kind of people who are willing to take a risk do that. And there's also a tradition in Tibetan Buddhism where of what's called sexual yoga, and you're supposed to engage with a sexual partner to change your physical body. And they say, some people say this, some people don't, but they say that if you want to reveal treasure, you need to sort of open up certain parts of your body that are otherwise closed, and the only way to do that is to engage in sexual yoga. So there were accusations that he was engaging in sex, and he's a fully ordained monk. So that's a serious accusation. So I don't know, all I could do in the book is speculate about that, because nobody else left a record of it. Nobody else, there's nothing else to read except for very cryptic and very few remarks about it in his diary. And I doubt we'll ever know the details.
Yeah.
But I did my best I could to really sort of to peel it out and explain what happened.
Kongtrul seems to me to be exemplary of a figure as far as expanding people's willingness to be curious about other traditions and things like that. What do you feel are some of the biggest lessons that people reading about Kongtrul's life can learn in 2019 going into 2020? Like, what does he exemplify as like a message of how to live?
Yeah, I think it's really is ecumenicalism. I think especially in America today, Kongtrul just had Buddhism to deal with, right? I mean, Bön to some degree, but it was very, very faint, and it's almost indistinguishable from Buddhism at this point. It's adopted so many characteristics. He didn't have to engage with Islam or Christianity or Judaism. I mean, he didn't have to think about how Buddhism relates to these traditions. He didn't have to read their material or listen to their teachers and sort of compare. He only had to deal with Buddhism. But we have to deal with all of these traditions. And I think his ecumenicalism holds true to us as well. That I was raised Christian, and I have a great deal of faith to Jesus, and I'm not going to pull that out of my heart, just because now I believe the truths of Buddhism or practice Buddhism. Jesus was an inspiring figure, and I think I can look at Muhammad, I can look at the great rabbis of the Judaist tradition and see they also taught something beautiful, and they also taught something. I don't have to engage with it. I don't have to become Islamic, Muslim. I don't have to become convert to any of these traditions, but I can recognize the beauty in it, and I can see in the followers of it, they're pursuing something noble. They're interested in peace and love and compassion and kindness, and some sort of transformation, and that's a beautiful thing. So I think Kongtrul did that in his own context, and I think he provides a model for us to do that as well.
Do you think that you could see yourself doing parts 2 and 3 and do biographies of his key collaborators?
I'd love to do a biography of Chögyam Lingpa. I mean, he was fascinating, really, really brilliant fellow. And there is a lot of material to do something, not in detail as Kongtrul's biography. Chögyam Lingpa, Khyentse Wangpo, unfortunately, he didn't leave a diary, and there's only one real biography of him, which Kongtrul wrote, and it's just a sort of a record of his teachings and his meditation practice. So there's really not that sort of first-hand, first-person access to his mind and his thinking where we have it with Kongtrul. So that I don't think I could do.
What are you working on next?
Well, outside of the Treasury of Lives, which keeps me very busy writing and editing biographies of and that is a very ecumenical. We have members of every tradition there, including some Japanese explorers and Russian monks as well. I mean, we're trying to anyone who touched on Tibet. So I have this dream of taking some of my dissertation chapters and turning them into academic articles. I think that'd be worthwhile, because I still go to conferences and it's still relevant. I'd like to engage with the academic community as well.
Wonderful. Well, Alex Gardner, I have really enjoyed reading this book, The Life of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great. I've loved learning about this new figure that I had never heard about before. I'm really grateful for the opportunity today to talk to you about it so that I can kind of, clarify and help me reframe some of the things that maybe I was confused about. And I'm just really grateful to you for spending this hour of time with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm grateful for your podcast series of getting everyone exposed and learning about different religions. I think it's a huge service to us all.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybeck. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.